I never thought I'd return to the dead. Not after what happened in New York. 3 years ago, I walked away from a career as a forensic anthropologist, from a job that consumed every ounce of my mind and spirit. I was good at reading bones, piecing together lives from fragments, uncovering truths no one else wanted to see. But after Emily, after the accident that took her from me, I couldn't do it anymore. I packed up my life and drove west until I couldn't drive any further. That's how I ended up in Blackwood Hollow, a speck of a town nestled in the dense forests of Oregon. Blackwood Hollow was supposed to be my escape, a quiet place where no one knew me, where the ghosts of my past couldn't find me. I'd taken a small, unassuming job at the town's lone medical clinic. It wasn't much, a few patients a day, some prescription renewals, an occasional sprained ankle. It was exactly what I needed. The townsfolk kept to themselves for the most part. They weren't unkind, but there was a natural suspicion of outsiders. Over time, they'd warmed to me, though I was still Dr. Walker from the city to most of them. And that was fine, until the day they found her body. It was late February, and the last traces of snow had melted into the forest floor, leaving behind patches of wet earth. A pair of hikers, regulars on the trails near Shadow Lake, stumbled across something they weren't prepared for. At first, they thought it was an animal carcass, a deer, maybe, or a bear that hadn't survived the winter. But then they saw the hand. Sheriff Calhoun came to the clinic later that day. He was a stocky, weathered man in his 50s, with a face that looked like it had seen its share of tragedies. "Dr. Walker," he said, his hat clutched in his hands. "We've got a situation." I knew what he was going to ask before he said it. "There's been a discovery near Shadow Lake. A body. And, well, I could use your help." "I'm not in that line of work anymore, Sheriff," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I understand that," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "But Blackwood Hollow's not exactly a hotspot for forensic expertise. The coroner's 3 towns over, and I don't trust her to get here before the buzzards finish the job." I wanted to say no, but I didn't. The site was about a mile off the main trail, nestled in a thicket of cedar trees. The air was damp and cold, heavy with the earthy scent of rotting leaves. The body, or what was left of it, lay half buried in the mud. The torso had been stripped of most of its flesh, the bones exposed in places, picked clean. The skull was intact but partially hidden beneath a tangle of matted hair. A thin layer of frost clung to the remains, a reminder that winter hadn't entirely loosened its grip. "It's been here a while," I said, crouching beside the body. "At least a couple of months." Calhoun stood a few feet away, his expression grim. "Think it's an animal attack?" he asked. "Possibly," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "But the way the body's been disturbed, it's not just scavengers. Something, or someone moved it." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Any idea who it is?" I shook my head. "Not yet, but there's enough here to work with. I'll need to examine the remains more closely." We moved the body to the small morgue at the clinic, a stark, sterile room that rarely saw use. As I began my examination, Calhoun leaned against the wall, watching silently. The first thing I noticed was the pattern of the wounds. "These aren't animal bites," I said, my voice steady despite the unease creeping in. "At least, not from any predator I've seen. The edges are too clean, almost surgical." Calhoun frowned. "You're saying this was done by a person?" "I'm saying it's a possibility," I said, "but I'll need more time to be sure." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the body in my mind, the strange precision of the cuts, the way it had been posed, as if whoever had done this wanted it to be found. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the steady rhythm of the rain against the window. But then came the knock. It was soft at first, barely audible. I froze, straining to listen. Then it came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and made my way to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just the cold night air and the faint sound of leaves rustling in the wind. And something else. A small object, lying on the porch. I bent down, shining the flashlight on it. It was a bone. Human. As I stared at the bone, A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a crime scene. Someone wanted me involved. I stared at the bone on the porch, my breath fogging in the cold night air. It wasn't large, part of a finger, I guessed, but it was unmistakably human. For a moment I didn't move. My mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. Had someone left it here deliberately? Was it connected to the body by Shadow Lake? I stepped back into the house, locking the door behind me. The bone sat on the kitchen table, its pale surface glinting under the overhead light. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't just leave it there. Grabbing a pair of latex gloves from my clinic bag, I examined it more closely. It was clean, too clean. The edges where it had been severed were sharp, as if it had been cut with a blade. This wasn't an accident. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every sound outside, every gust of wind, every creak of the house, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. When morning finally came, I drove straight to the clinic, the bone wrapped carefully in a cloth. Sheriff Calhoun was already waiting for me when I arrived. "You look like hell," he said, his tone blunt but not unkind. I handed him the bone without a word. His face darkened as he unwrapped it. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. "On my porch," I said. Calhoun's eyes narrowed. "You're sure it's human?" I nodded. "It matches the remains we found at Shadow Lake. Same clean cuts, same condition." He let out a long breath, running a hand over his face. "This isn't random," he said. "Someone's trying to get your attention." "That's what I'm afraid of," I said. For the rest of the morning, I worked on the remains from the lake. The process was slow, meticulous. Cleaning the bones, cataloging each fragment, searching for clues. I found more signs of precision. Deliberate cuts on the ribs, the femur, the skull. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. But there was something else. The skull had been marked. At first, I thought it was just damage from the elements, but as I cleaned it, a pattern began to emerge. Small, deliberate carvings etched into the bone. I traced the marks with my gloved finger, my stomach tightening as I realized they weren't random. They were symbols. By the time Calhoun returned, I was pacing the morgue, the unease gnawing at me. "I think we're dealing with more than just a murder," I said, showing him the skull. He studied the carvings, his expression unreadable. "You recognize these?" he asked. "No," I said, "but they weren't made by accident. Whoever did this had a reason." Calhoun exhaled sharply, leaning against the counter. "I'll send this to the state lab," he said. "See if they can make sense of it." "In the meantime?" I asked. "In the meantime, you keep your doors locked," he said. "And if anything else shows up on your porch, you call me first." That night, I double-checked every lock in the house, every window, every door. The forest around Blackwood Hollow felt darker than usual, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I tried to focus on anything other than the bone, the carvings, the body in the morgue. But as the hours ticked by, the tension only grew. At around midnight, I heard it again. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. They were soft, almost hesitant, like someone walking just beyond the edge of the porch. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window, my heart pounding. Through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness. But the footsteps continued, circling the house. I opened the front door, shining the flashlight into the yard. The beam caught something in the snow, a set of footprints, fresh and deliberate, leading toward the tree line. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The only response was the wind rustling through the trees. The footprints stopped at the edge of the forest, disappearing into the underbrush. I hesitated, my mind torn between fear and the need for answers. I stepped outside, following the trail to the edge of the woods. That's when I saw it. A small object hanging from the branch of a tree. It was a charm crudely made, with twigs tied together in the shape of a star. Beneath it, carved into the bark, was a single word: "Watch." I backed away slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, a presence pressing down on me from the darkness. I turned and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room, the lights on, the poker from the fireplace clutched tightly in my hands. I didn't sleep. The next morning, Calhoun was at my door again. I showed him the footprints, the charm, the carving. "Someone's trying to scare you," he said grimly. "Well, it's working," I said. Calhoun promised to send deputies to patrol the area, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Blackwood Hollow was a quiet town. Things like this didn't happen here, at least not until now. As Calhoun left, I noticed something in the distance, just beyond the trees. A figure standing perfectly still. When I blinked, it was gone. The figure near the trees lingered in my mind long after it disappeared. Could have been a trick of the light, or maybe my tired eyes were playing games with me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. Someone was there. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the curtains drawn tight. The house was quiet except for the faint creak of the walls and the occasional whisper of wind against the windows. I'd locked every door and window twice, but it didn't feel like enough. The charm from the woods sat in a plastic evidence bag in front of me, its crude design both simple and menacing. Next to it was a notebook where I jotted down every strange thing that had happened since the body was found at Shadow Lake. The bone on the porch, the carvings on the skull, the charm hanging from the tree, the word watch. Each detail felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. At some point, exhaustion overtook me. I must have dozed off at the table because I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone knocking softly on the glass. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window, the beam trembling in my unsteady hand. When I pulled the curtain back, the yard was empty. But there was something new. A single handprint smeared into the frost on the outside of the glass. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't random. Someone wanted me to know they were there. But who? The next morning, I drove straight to the sheriff's office, my unease growing with every passing minute. Calhoun was already there, a cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as I walked in. "I might have," I said, showing him the photo I'd taken of the handprint. Calhoun studied it, his face grim. "Whoever this is," he said, "they're getting bolder." We sat in his office, going over everything we knew so far. The remains at Shadow Lake, the strange carvings, the charm in the woods. "It doesn't make sense," I said. "The carvings, the symbols, they don't fit with any of the cases I've worked before." "Could it be some kind of ritual?" Calhoun asked. "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "But if it is, it's not like anything I've seen." Calhoun leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I've got deputies patrolling the area," he said. "But if this person's as careful as they seem, I don't know if we'll catch them in the act." I nodded, though the thought didn't bring me any comfort. That evening I went back to the woods. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but the unease gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. If someone was leaving these signs for me, I needed to understand why. The path to Shadow Lake was quiet, the snow muffling my footsteps. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches twisting against the gray sky. When I reached the clearing where we'd found the body, the air felt colder, heavier. The ground was still disturbed from where the remains had been removed, but there was something new. Another charm, tied to a low-hanging branch. This one was different. A circle made of woven twigs, with a piece of red cloth tied in the center. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the icy air. Beneath the charm, carved into the trunk of a tree, was a series of symbols. They were sharp and angular, overlapping in a way that made them hard to decipher. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo, my hands trembling. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint sound, carried on the wind. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder. Laughter. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I scanned the trees, the flashlight's beam slicing through the shadows. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it was almost suffocating. I didn't wait to find out who or what was out there. I turned and ran, the branches clawing at my jacket as I made my way back to the trail. When I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped to catch my breath, glancing back one last time. The charm was gone. That night, as I sat in my living room, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The text was short, just 4 words. "You're getting too close." I stared at the message, my hands trembling. This wasn't just a game. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let me walk away. The text sat on my screen, the words glaring back at me like a warning I couldn't ignore. "You're getting too close." I stared at it, my mind racing. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something told me that whoever had sent the message was the same person leaving the charms, the carvings, and the handprint. I tried to trace the number, but it led nowhere, just a dead-end string of digits that didn't match any known service. By the next morning, the unease had turned into something worse: dread. At the clinic, I tried to focus on my work, but every patient, every phone call, felt like a distraction from the mounting tension in the back of my mind. Sheriff Calhoun called just after noon. "We've got a lead," he said. "Thought you'd want to know." The lead came from a woman named Grace Henley, a longtime resident of Blackwood Hollow. She'd come into the station that morning, shaken and pale, claiming to have seen something or someone in her backyard the night before. "She says it was a man," Calhoun told me as I met him outside her house. Tall, wearing dark clothes. Said he was standing just at the edge of her property, watching the house. "Did she recognize him?" I asked. "No," Calhoun said, "but she found this." He handed me a small bag containing another charm, similar to the one I'd seen in the woods. This one was shaped like a cross, with thin strands of hair knotted around the center. "She found it hanging from her porch light," Calhoun said grimly. Grace's house was on the outskirts of town, near the forest. It was a modest place, neat and well-kept, but the sight of the charm dangling from the porch light gave it an eerie, unwelcoming feel. Inside, Grace was still visibly shaken. She was in her 60s, with a kind face now drawn tight with fear. "He was just standing there," she said, her hands trembling as she held a mug of tea. "Didn't move, didn't say anything. I turned on the porch light, and he was gone." Calhoun asked her a few more questions, but her answers didn't reveal much we didn't already know. When we stepped back outside, I studied the charm again. "Whoever's doing this isn't random," I said. "They're targeting specific people." "Why her?" Calhoun asked. "That's what we need to figure out," I said. That night I went back to the morgue. The symbols carved into the skull had been bothering me, their meaning just out of reach. I spread out the photos I'd taken, comparing them to the carvings on the tree near Shadow Lake. There was a pattern, but it was incomplete. I worked late into the night, my mind spinning with possibilities. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise, faint at first, but persistent. It was coming from outside. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, the world eerily silent. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. They didn't move, didn't say anything. They just watched. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. I stepped forward, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. But when the light hit the figure, they were gone. The next morning, I went straight to the sheriff's office. "We're missing something," I said, dropping the photos and notes onto his desk. Calhoun leaned forward, studying the evidence. "You think it's all connected?" he asked. "I know it is," I said, "but we're not seeing the whole picture." Together we pored over the details. The body at Shadow Lake, the charms, the carvings, the strange symbols. That's when it hit me. The symbols weren't random, they were coordinates. Using a map of the area, I traced the symbols to a location deep in the forest, miles from any trail. "What's out there?" Calhoun asked. "Let's find out," I said. The hike to the location was grueling, the forest dense and unwelcoming. The farther we went, the quieter it became, as if even the birds and animals didn't dare venture this deep. When we finally arrived, we found a clearing. And in the center of the clearing was a small cabin. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and warped. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols like the ones on the skull and the tree. In the corner of the cabin, we found something that made my stomach turn. A makeshift altar, covered in bones. Some were animal, but others were human. On the altar was a single, freshly carved symbol. It was the same one I'd found on the skull. And beneath it, scrawled in black ink, was a message. "This is only the beginning." The message on the altar, "This is only the beginning," sat in my mind like a warning I couldn't escape. The cabin was silent, the only sounds coming from the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath our feet and the faint whistle of wind through the broken boards of the windows. Sheriff Calhoun stood beside me, his face pale but resolute. "We need to call this in," he said, his voice low. "The state police, the feds. Someone who can handle this." "Handle what?" I asked, gesturing to the bones, the carvings, the symbols etched into the walls. "We don't even know what this is." Calhoun didn't answer. He didn't have to, because we both knew the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. We left the cabin untouched, marking the location on the map before heading back through the woods. The hike back to town was suffocating. The trees seemed closer now, the shadows darker, the silence heavier. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, the sun was setting, casting the town in a dim, eerie glow. Calhoun went straight to the station to report what we'd found, but I couldn't bring myself to join him. Instead, I went home, locking every door and window before sitting down at the kitchen table. The photo of the altar sat in front of me, the words, "This is only the beginning," burning into my memory. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like a threat. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again. The footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the house. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window, my heart pounding. This time I didn't pull the curtain back. Instead, I stood there, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped, and then came the knock. It wasn't on the front door. It was on the back door, sharp and deliberate. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. Another knock, louder this time. I forced myself to move, creeping through the dark house until I reached the kitchen. The back door loomed in the faint glow of the porch light, the frost-covered glass obscuring whatever was on the other side. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and swung it open. No one was there, but hanging from the porch light was another charm. This one was different. A small bundle of twigs wrapped in red thread, with a single tooth tied to the center. I reached up to grab it, but as I did, I noticed something in the snow. Footprints, leading away from the house and toward the woods. I didn't follow them. Not this time. Instead, I called Calhoun, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. "Stay put," he said. "I'm on my way." By the time he arrived, the footprints had already started to fade, the falling snow covering them like a blanket. Calhoun studied the charm, his jaw tightening. "This has to stop," he said. I didn't respond, because I knew stopping it wasn't going to be that simple. The next day, the state police arrived. They cordoned off the cabin, collected the bones, and promised an investigation. But their faces told me they didn't have any answers, just questions. That night, as I sat in the clinic, trying to piece everything together, my phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number. "You should have left it alone." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. The next morning, Calhoun called me into his office. "They ID'd the remains," he said, his voice heavy. "The ones from Shadow Lake." "Who is it?" I asked. "A girl named Abigail Gray," he said. "She went missing 6 months ago. Lived up in Millstone, about 30 miles north of here." The name didn't mean anything to me, but the look in Calhoun's eyes did. "What is it?" I asked. "There's something else," he said, sliding a photo across the desk. It was a picture of Abigail, taken from her driver's license. And around her neck was a charm. It was identical to the ones I'd found. That night, I went back to the cabin. Alone. The police had cleared out, leaving the place dark and silent. Inside, the air felt heavier, colder, as if the cabin itself were alive. I stood in the center of the room, staring at the altar, the carvings, the symbols on the walls. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice breaking the silence. For a moment, there was nothing, and then I heard it. A faint whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, the beam catching something on the wall. A new carving, fresh and deep. My name. I left Blackwood Hollow the next day. I told myself it was to escape, to leave the madness behind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Because wherever I went, the whispers followed. Sometimes the dead aren't the ones you should fear. Sometimes it's the living.